Well, it came out. So, most of the stuff you can find in the abstract. This is really kind of an interesting article because they did 2 experiments. The first experiment, they had both males and females. The second experiment, they only had males. One of the things that they were looking at, anytime we're talking about males and sexual, and anything sexual, what they do is they put a indicator around their penis to find out if they're getting aroused. Does that make sense? How are we going to figure out if they're lying to us or not? Men lie all the time. It's not true, is it? We don't. But men lie all the time, which is kind of a tragedy in itself. So one of the things they measured was penile tumescence. Tumescence means arousal. It means erection. It means swelling, actually, is what tumescence means. So it doesn't have to be a penis, it could be anything. All right, so the summary of the article is that there were two experiments. They were looking at, some of them were sexually explicit. They all had to do with violence, or some of them had to do with violence. But they were looking at violence to see how aroused males would get, and how aroused females would get, which was kind of interesting in itself. This article is from 1987. Or is that 86? It's from 1986, okay. From 1986. And as we were saying last time, what has changed in sexual response since 1986? Is there a difference now than there used to be?
Yeah, there's like men being with men and women being with women.
Oh, homosexuality.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
Well, if we're
Like
talking,
it's more graphic now.
why? Why is it more graphic?
I don't know, people's fantasies just went up, I guess. I don't know.
What's feeding their fantasies?
Media.
Pornography. Okay. So what has changed as far as pornography is concerned?
It's more graphic.
It is more graphic, but why?
More aggressive, more, how would you say?
Why? What was going on in 1986? What is going on now that wasn't going on in 1986?
They were more disciplined back then, I think. So,
I think it was like probably hard to get,
Right.
and then now it's easy you can actually just type it in.
Media,
Yeah.
The internet.
Yeah, we could watch pornography. Well, we can't because there's no internet. But you can go on the internet and find anything you want. In 1986.
so they were limited then.
Well, there was no internet in 1986. The internet wasn't invented until 1993, except for the military. The military had it. And they wouldn't give it up because the Cold War was still going on, and they used the internet as a targeting mechanism. That's where they use GPS GIS as well. It's actually a targeting system. And now you've got it in your car, okay? But back in 1986, before the Cold War stopped. The Cold War didn't stop until 1989. It didn't stop until the Soviet Union broke up. And now it may come back, but we're not going to talk about that. So what we have here is, this is 1986. So this is interesting, but it may not be accurate for today. Does that make sense? Okay. So we will probably talk about that in our conclusion. What was the hypothesis of the research? The hypothesis is somewhere. Okay. In the 2 experiments we assessed the impact. That's not the hypothesis. We may have to go to another page to find the hypothesis.
Would it be the only male subjects participate in the second experiment?
Are you looking at the abstract, still at the abstract?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, okay. I don't think we're going to find it in the abstract. I think we're going to have to go to another page. Let's check out another page. Let's see, the present studies, okay. On page 331. The major purpose of our experiments were to study among the non-rapist population the impact of aggression on sexual arousal in a manner that would rectify the three problems just noted, and to analyze the factors relating to sexual arousal from aggression in order to better understand the basis for such arousal. Does that make sense? Okay, so what we had to do in order to find the hypothesis was to go to the present study, where they talk about the present study. The hypothesis wasn't actually, or maybe it was, but it was just hidden. So this paragraph tells us what their hypothesis is.
Okay, it says the major purpose. The first sentence actually says it. The major purpose of our experiments
Was to study among the population. Actually, that's all one sentence. It is. It's all one sentence. The whole paragraph's report. Okay, so the next information that we need is type of study. Was it qualitative, quantitative, or a mixture of both? This gets kind of interesting because they are measuring something. And what they are measuring is the tumescence of the males. So they're measuring the arousal. So we know it's quantitative. That aspect is quantitative. But the question is, what else did they do in order to measure these things? Where was this study done? It's not going to tell you where it's done. It's not going to say, well, we did this in Gallup, New Mexico. They're not going to tell you that. They're going to say, we did this study in a medium-sized city in New Mexico. That's what they're going to tell you. But can we tell where it was done? The only way we can tell where it's done is by looking at the authors. In this case, all three authors are from Canada. They're all Canadian. So this is probably a Canadian study done on Canadians, I'm guessing. It's too expensive for them to wander someplace else to do research. So they probably did it in their hometown. And at the time, they were probably all at the same institution, but potentially. But it was all in Canada. It was all done in Canada. So this is a Canadian study. Now, with your vast knowledge of Canadians, are they the same as Americans?
No.
I don't know. So can we generalize this to the United States? Well, let's see if we can.
To an extent, I think.
I'm sorry?
To an extent, I think.
Okay. Well, let's see what their population consisted of. And the population is really, really important. Where it was done is really, really important, but they never tell you where it was done. Someplace they should say subjects, right there at the bottom of page 331. It says subjects. The subjects were 37 male, 43 female psychology undergraduates. Okay, so how old were these kids? They were college students. And they were undergraduates, which means they weren't graduate students. So they're probably potentially in their late teens, early 20s. Okay? Can we generalize that to the general population? But so they're all college kids. They're horny little college kids. I guess I should put horny out of there. Potentially. Or some of them may have been non-traditional students. We don't know. Approximately equal numbers were randomly assigned to each condition. It's really interesting that they don't give us a racial breakdown of these individuals. Unless we understand that Canada is 97% white and 3% Native. Except they don't call them natives, they call them First Nation people. Okay, so potentially these were all white people. Potentially. There may have been some Asians. There may have been some people of African descent. But they don't have that many black people in Canada. It's kind of curious. Okay, so what are we looking for? We're looking for, what piece of information are we looking for? We figured it's quantitative, but there may be a qualitative aspect to this. Shouldn't there be a qualitative aspect? What's the three things that they're measuring? They're measuring tumescence in the second. The subjects. Female subjects reported more sexual arousal in response to non-aggression than to aggressive depictions when the portrayals were sexually explicit. Now, how in the world did they measure female sexual arousal? That's a question, right? We know how they measured the male sexual arousal. How did they measure the female sexual arousal? Now, here we go, sexual arousal. Sexual arousal analyzed, this is on page 332. Sexual arousal analyzed with a 2x2 analysis of variance at novo, which doesn't mean anything whatsoever. What are they doing? So how did they measure it? Subjects participated, okay, I'm still on 332, looking at procedure. Subjects participated in their classes. The experimenter stated that some might find the stories offensive, that responses were completely anonymous, and that anyone could leave at any time without penalty. 2 persons left the room. Subjects were also told that they were under no obligation to fill out the materials. They were then given a written story with an attached questionnaire. After completing it, subjects were given a written debriefing. For those who read violent depictions, the story stressed the terrible nature of violence against women and presented a number of points designed to dispel rape myths. So how did they, I guess they got the female sexual arousal from the way they answered the questionnaire, I'm guessing. Okay. All right, so it's quantitative. And possibly there's an aspect of qualitative research in there since they were interpreting what the women were saying. What was the sample? We know what the sample was. We've got it on the abstract. The sample were 37 males and 43 females. Describe the target population in the sample. We really don't need to make any other, they don't give us any other information. All we know is that there's 43 females and 37 males. How were they selected? These were undergraduate college students. And like I said before, this is really important. They used to do a lot of research on prisoners and people in prisons, individuals that are incarcerated. We don't do that anymore. In order to test a prison population, we have to get, researchers have to get permission from everybody that is in charge of those prisoners. Describe the target population and sample. These individuals were undergraduate students, and we see that a lot, especially in undergraduate psychology classes. A lot of times they become subjects of research. Because, why? Well, why? Why would I use the three of you? Why would I use the three of you? Outside the room. Why would they use individuals? Why is this important? Why would I use the three of you? Why wouldn't I go to Granada and test people in Granada? Why wouldn't I run out to Tuba City? It's bigger, right? In Salem? Like every place is bigger than Salem. Okay? So why would I use my college students? I'm sorry?
Age differences?
You're not a kid. You're not a kid. You're not a kid. Non-traditional students. Why wouldn't I use the kids in Granada? It's cheaper. I'm a cheap bastard. That's why. It's easier. I can and I can give you credit for it. I don't have to pay you, because I can give you credit for doing my research. So this is one of the reasons why there is so much research done on especially undergraduate psychology students. So the target population, all we know about the target population is there's 43 females and 37 males. How were they selected? They were undergraduate psychology students. Do you think there was any evidence of bias? So what do you think? Was there any evidence of bias? Can we generalize this to everybody in the United States? I mean, in Canada in this case. Except we don't know that, do we? They could have snuck across the border tested people at the University of Montana or something. Is there any bias in this? Can you see any bias? Doing research on 43 females and 37 males from an undergraduate psychology class. Do you think it's accurate? Can we generalize it to another population, any other population other than?
It's not accurate.
So it's biased.
Yes.
There is bias too. For one thing, they may be younger. We don't know. Do they give us an age range? I don't think they do. So it may be a younger population. As we know, males are at their sexual peak at age 19, as odd as it may seem. So these may be more, these individuals may be more sexually triggered than individuals that are older, or individuals that are younger, certainly. All right, I don't see any breakdown of those there. Okay, so there may have been bias in this. Does that make sense? Okay. Don't be afraid to see bias in your research. Almost everybody does, especially psychological research. There's usually something, even though the researchers pretend that there's not. Okay? Anytime you do research only on college students, you're using a special population. So you really can't generalize it to anybody except that population. I did research one time with American Indians up in Montana. Could I generalize it to American Indians in the Southwest? No, not really, because they're different. I was in Montana. Could I generalize it to the American Indians in North Dakota? It would be a closer fit, but potentially not. The individuals I was working with were only from that one place. Okay, so there is bias in just about all research. And probably, Sarah says the same, that there's bias in just about all research. But we try to reduce the amount of bias that we have in any research. Because we're trying to generalize it. We need to generalize it to the general population. Okay, so what other questions do we need to answer here? Do you think there was a bias? Describe how the data was collected. Okay, so there we're talking about the procedure of the research. And they read them stories. They read them stories that had sexual violence in it. I guess that's for the first one. And the second one, they only used males. In the second experiment, they had 367 males in introductory psychology. They were introductory psychology students, so the vast majority of these individuals were probably traditional students. They're probably 18, 19 years old. 8 subjects, however, did not respond to the question of how sexually aroused they were by the use of force, and were therefore not included in the analysis. After completing the orientation questionnaire and being presented with a general depiction of the laboratory session, 123 subjects also signed up for the laboratory phase. And this is the part where they put the indicator around the penis. And in addition for being given experimental credit for just coming to the orientation session, subjects were signed up for the laboratory phase, were given credit for arriving at the laboratory. For showing up. They gave them credit for showing up. I think that's wonderful. Of those who signed up for the laboratory session, 5 decided not to participate after arriving at the laboratory. The remaining 118 subjects were randomly assigned to various experimental conditions. And then they read them, or they had to read more stories. Some stories were not sexually violent. Some stories were just violent, but they weren't sexual. There wasn't a sexual component to the stories. And they measured their level of arousal. What else do I need to say? Analysis of the data. One of the things that I want you to recognize is one of the hardest things that that I encountered when I was starting to do research was that I didn't know what type of statistics to use. I'm not a mathematician, I'm a psychologist, and I'm pretty stupid about that kind of stuff. So one of the things I want you to get used to is reading and understanding what we're talking about as far as statistics are concerned. You don't have to know how to do an ANOVA, you just need to know that in this case, using this questionnaire, they use an ANOVA. And that's really what I want you to know. I'm not really trying to teach you statistics. I couldn't teach you statistics. That's Dr. Wolf and Dr. Tyne's job. But I want you to be aware of the nomenclature that they use, the t-test, the p-value, the ANOVA, the MANOVA, all of these different things, these different ways of looking at things. So that's what I'm asking you to do, is find out what kind of statistics they use. Which reminds me, I forgot my phone. Thank you. I left my phone at home. But who's going to call me? My wife? She's 2 days away. No matter how I go there, she's still 2 days away. Okay. So analysis of the data has to do with just identifying the statistical tests that they use. And as we saw, they use the ANOVA. A lot of times they use a regression analysis. And I want you to get used to the nomenclature of the statistics. In reality, when you read a research article, usually you just bounce right over that stuff. You don't even look at it. You assume that they use the right statistics. And sometimes that's not true. But the only people who can figure that out are other statisticians, not us. Normally when somebody does research, if they are not a statistician, they will hire a statistician to do the statistics. That's the way it works. One of these individuals may not have had anything to do with the research, he was the statistician. And I would bet it's a guy from Manitoba. Yeah, I bet it's a guy from Manitoba. University of Manitoba. Anyway. As curious as that is. So a lot of times you'll see two people, at least two people. Normally you don't just see one person doing empirical research. There's usually a second person, and that person is probably the guy that did the statistics, the individual who did the statistics. Okay, so analysis of the data. What were the reported findings of the study? There is a section where we discuss the results. If you look on page 336, as you can see, they've broken everything down. Look at all the statistics they put in there. Okay. And then they've tried to explain the statistics. The only people that understand that, they give you an X value, a P value. What else do they give you? X and P. Anyway, yeah. So they tell you what group of individuals. This is, I didn't even see this. Wow. Look at, there's a whole page of them trying to debrief these people. Anyway. So, if you look at table 2 on page 338, subjects report regarding whether they might rape or might force a woman in future as a function of arousal from force group. Remember there were 118. No, there were 95. Oh, 95 said no, 122 were moderate, so they might rape, and there were 72 individuals that had a high possibility of raping. Now, what do we know? Do we know anything about the sexual response? Is it different in Canada than it is in the United States?
Maybe.
They tend to have more spousal abuse. As interesting as that is. What's another thing we know about Canada? Trafficking is bigger in Canada than it is in the United States.
Yeah, alcohol and drug use too?
Alcohol and drug use is higher. They didn't go through prohibition, so the alcohol that they drink is harder. than it is in the United States. A lot of beer down here.
It's like a lot, they drink a lot of
It's got a lot more alcohol. Most of the beer in the United States is 3.2. It's 3.2% alcohol, which that's not very much at all. It takes a lot of beers to get drunk, but in Canada it's like 14%. In Australia, it's really strong beer too. Yeah, and they're bigger cans. They've got like liter cans, and then they have those other cans. They don't have 12-ounce cans, okay? It's like 16-ounce cans of beer. Molson's, that's the beer we need. And Labatt's. Real strong stuff. I know. Don't ask them about they think our beer is Kool-Aid. Coors, Colorado Kool-Aid. You've never heard anybody say that? Anyway, okay, so we can look at the discussion and we can find the results. The results generally replicated and extended the findings obtained in the first experiment, ensuring that aggression may be a sexual stimulant. From some individuals. For some individuals from the general population, the data confirmed that men's reported sexual arousal from forcing a woman assessed to a preliminary session is predictive of an actual sexual arousal that was assessed in a later session. And of course, we've done more studies with this, and what we have discovered is that there's a relatively significant portion of the population that this is their fantasy. Is rape is a fantasy for these select individuals. When they looked at the United States military, of course the military can do anything that they want, and they tested everybody. And what they discovered was that it's about 17% of the population, of the male population in the military thinks that rape is, if they could get away with it, they would do it. 17% of the population. That's a lot of guys if you think about it. It's a lot of guys. Anyway, and so this research kind of replicated that. It kind of supported that idea. This is in the general population, of course, or is it in the general population? Is it in the general population? Can we generalize it to the population of Canada or the United States? Probably not. These are college kids, so they're at their peak of their sexual response. Anyway, that's how you do an article critique. Fascinating stuff. I find this stuff just blindly fascinating. Of course, these are all things that people worry about. Rape, everybody should be worried about and should care about. All right. Any questions about how you do an article critique? It's not that hard. It shouldn't take you very long. I'm hoping what you'll do is read the material and then tell me what you think the material is saying, not cut and paste. If you cut and paste, yeah, it's the same stuff, but sometimes you don't understand what they're talking about. I want to know that you don't understand what they're talking about. Because the reality is, in the future, when you go off to graduate school, they're going to expect you to read these things and understand what they're talking about. The information that you're getting from your article critique teaches you how to read a research article. And you should be able to read just about any research article. Does that make sense?
I think on my part, I have difficulty on quality and quantitative.
I'm sorry? Qualitative, you have a problem with qualitative and quantitative?
Yeah, like distinguishing which, what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Quantitative has to do with numbers.
Yeah.
Okay. So anytime they're giving you results in numbers, it's quantitative.
Okay.
Qualitative has to do with a level. So when you're talking about high, medium, and low, like they did in this research. So this is mixed research.
Yeah.
Okay. That aspect is qualitative. Does that make sense? Because that is one of the results that they got. They were talking about possibility of rape.
Yeah. High rate and then.
And as you saw, almost everybody, well, the largest number was moderate. And the lowest number was high, but we want the highest number to be low, not to be moderate. So there is always a possibility.
Okay.
Okay.
So in the research, if it, like this article, you said it's qualitative and quantitative. So
Right.
like
You'd say-
this state, of course.
It's both, yeah, and it's mixed. Okay. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. Some empirical research will only be quantitative. Most of it will be. If the number of people that they use in the research is low, if they use an interview in the research, then it will be qualitative, because they are interpreting what the person has said. Okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
makes
So,
sense.
so,
Makes sense, I said.
okay. So these critiques are gonna be due
Week.
every week?
Yeah, one a week.
Assignments to
Sure. Okay. This is talking about rape, and I find this topic really important, because if you look on the internet at the pornography that people are looking at now, a lot of it has to do with sexual violence against women, and because of that, are we triggering people to rape? But one of the other things that we're seeing in the general population is sexual response seems to be declining. So people are probably masturbating, okay? But they're masturbating to rape pornography. A lot of violence, a lot of physical violence, as strange as that may seem. A lot of things have changed. 1986, there were videos out, of course. There were VHSs, I think, DVDs yet. Okay. Anyway, VHSs. There were tapes out there. But in order to buy a tape, it wasn't as easy to buy a tape. Now you can just go on the internet. I mean, golly, you can watch just about any movie on Netflix. And they also have pornographic movies on Netflix, but they also have pornographic movies on YouTube. And if you go to any pornographic site, they will have pornographic movies. And you can select the topic that you want, whatever topic you floats your boat or trips your trigger or whatever. And sadly, of course, when we talk about tripping the trigger, that's exactly what happens with rape. The individual uses the pornography to prime themselves, and then potentially they go out. And this is a small percentage of the population, but from this research, we can see that a relatively large percentage of the individuals were high for possible rape. They were aroused by this type of story, the violence. And this was just a story. This didn't include any pictures. They weren't looking at pictures. And now, of course, with the internet, you know, it's a totally different ballgame, unfortunately. But we have this research behind us telling us that males are kind of interesting beings, I guess.
And they're more, I believe that people are more aggressive nowadays.
I think you're right. I think,
Back then,
right,
they're more like, what did you say, so direct.
right.
You know, so really aggressive.
And that may be because we don't interact as much as we used to. I'm talking to all of you, but if you're walking down the sidewalk and you pass me, you may be looking at your telephone. So you're here more than you're here, more than you're up, more than you're looking, more than you're in the environment. You're in this strange fantasy land where you're talking to your friends or emailing or Twittering. I forgot my phone. I had a student, this is last semester, I had a student discover that they had forgotten their phone and they ran out of the classroom like it was a tragedy, it's an emergency. I was worried about them. You know, it's just a kid, one of the 18, 19-year-olds that we have at this institution. But you can imagine, when I was teaching at Ashford, most of my students were non-traditional. And geez, those guys were on their phone constantly. I mean, I couldn't get them to look up at me. I would ask them a question, And you know, I do this in class. I start a question and I ask everybody in the class, and I will have gone through almost the entire class, and they're on their phone, and I ask them the question, and they have no clue what's going on. They haven't listened to what anybody else said. They weren't listening to my question. They were doing whatever was on their phone. It was more important than what was going on in the class. And I probably should crack down on that, right? I'm an educator. I should educate everybody in the class, not just the people that don't have cell phones or the people that have their cell phones turned on. But the reality is, or my feeling is, that these individuals are going to have to learn how to do this. They're going to have to learn what's important and what's not important. And I'm not the one to tell them to get off their cell phone. The more I tell them to get off their cell phone, the more likely that they're going to respond in a negative manner by rebelling against what I tell them. That's my, and I don't want to deal with it. Let's save it. Okay, let's go ahead. We'll do a little bit of lecture today. So is that demonstrative? Do you guys understand what I'm talking about? I know this is a kind of a fun one. I say fun because it was an interesting topic. We're going to be talking about biology. We're going to be talking about physiology. So it's not going to be nearly as exciting as sexual response. But you know, I just thought it would be interesting to look at that. What class am I teaching? What is this? Physiological? All right. All right. There's my ex-wife. I can't see her very well. Anyway, it's my ex-wife. Not really. That's an actress that looks like my ex-wife. I hope you're impressed. Francis, are you impressed? Okay. She was an alcoholic. I didn't realize she was an alcoholic. That's why the marriage didn't last very long. So while she was with me, I'm real easy to, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for?
You're easily gullible.
Gullible? No. Well, she was using me to clean up. And she didn't drink at all while I knew her. Actually, we had a drinking contest at one point. And I think I got drunk on 2 beers, and she got drunk on 3 beers or something. It was really kind of strange. But the other thing is she didn't like beers, so they called her, and I didn't know this until later, that they called her the Jack Daniels Kid. That was her nickname. I know, so she was drinking hard stuff. So yeah, getting drunk on 3 beers, I don't think so. Okay, so we're talking about biology. And she hung out as long as she possibly could. And then she just couldn't stand it anymore and she left. She was just a kid. She wasn't very old. She was born in 54. I was born in 49. She's 5 years younger than I. So she's just a kid. We're only in our early 20s. So. 5 viewpoints of biology of behavior. Describing the behavior is one thing. Studying the evolution of the behavior. How has it changed over time? And sexual response is one thing. And of course, what we looked at was the evolution of sexual response in the United States. And now it has changed. It's changed completely. And the reason it's changed completely is because of the internet and the access to pornography that we have now that we didn't have before, or that they didn't have before, or that people didn't have before. If you wanted pornography, you had to buy a VHS, you had to buy a magazine. And of course, pictures and magazines are relatively static. In other words, there's no movement. But then again, videos, of course, are a little bit more explicit, because something is actually happening in the video. So the evolution of the behavior has changed. So if we're trying to figure out why men rape, we understand that violence is sexually arousing for a certain percentage of the population, and in this case, it was, I don't know, about 25%. somewhere in the 25% range were found violence and sex sexually arousing. Observing the development of the behavior and its biological characteristics over the lifespan, how does it change? As we said, there was a potential bias in this research, mainly because they were only dealing with teenage boys. Yeah, let's call them teenage boys. Or 20-year-olds, or 21-year-olds. They weren't very old. So these were relatively young individuals. How does this equate to a 35-year-old man, or a 50-year-old man, or a 70-year-old man? Or does it equate at all? Can we generalize this to an older population? And the answer is probably no. So sexual response changes over the lifespan. Studying the biological mechanisms of the behavior, and of course, in this case, they were looking at stories with sexual violence in it, and of course, that's what some pornography is anyway. Studying applications of biological psychology, the dysfunctions and the lack of function. As I said last time, the dysfunctions are what we actually identify the situation with. The first thing we look at is dysfunction. We don't look at normal behavior. If it's normal behavior, we ignore it because we don't have a problem. It's the dysfunction that is the problem, and we are here to solve problems, aren't we? Or are we? There's something called positive psychology, where you don't ignore problems, but you accentuate normality. When I was trying to do research up north on the Indian reservation, people suggested, well, you need to look at alcoholism. It's a real serious problem here. You need to look at drug abuse. You need to look at child abuse. You need to look at spousal abuse. And I was thinking, everybody identifies American Indians with all these negative things because that's what the research is. Why don't I look at something positive? So I looked at resilience. It made more sense to me. I had a lot of friends up there. They were really nice people. They had been, a lot of them had been alcoholics at one point in their lives. Some of them had been drug addicts. I don't know if they abused their children. But I wanted to accentuate the positive rather than accentuate the negative. Too many people think of American Indians as drunks. And I wanted to get people to start thinking of American Indians as resilient. And the reality is, if you've survived up to this point, that's fairly resilient. I would say that's fairly resilient. And the problem up there was that the kids would drink. The teenagers would drink. And they'd get in a car and kill themselves. Yeah, a lot of automobile deaths. So the life expectancy for natives in the county where I lived was 60. That was a life expectancy, 60. And the reason was because we had all these 18 and 19-year-olds who were killing themselves from automobile accidents. And people were living into their 70s and 80s. One person lived to be 113. I know. But we had all those kids that were and there were suicides too. That was a problem that they had up there. Before a scientist can do any research on biological function, they must decide and describe the function that they will research, and of course that's what they were looking for in the research we just talked about. They were looking for sexual arousal to violence. And they wanted to see how many females were sexually aroused. And I saw that in here somewhere. It is in here somewhere. Because they looked at the sexual arousal of violence for females. And males. And it was like 3 times higher for males than it was for females. But there were females who were sexually aroused by sexual violence. It was a relatively small percentage, but it was still there. And they actually described it. Anyway, as interesting as that is, So when we're talking about this, of course, we can't discount the fact that some females find sexual violence arousing. I think that's what the story 50 Shades of Grey is about. He's a sadist, and she finds violence arousing. Okay. I don't know. I haven't read any of that stuff. I haven't watched the movies either.
I haven't either, but I've heard.
My wife won't let me watch it. It's just interesting. And you know, rich people raping people is not my idea of a good time. That's just not. I don't find that interesting at all. By comparing species, scientists can speculate how behavior and neural structures have changed as species have evolved. And of course, things have evolved, and this is one of the ways that we can tell. We can look back in our anthropologic past, and we can see what structures we had back then and what structures we have now. We can compare the brains of an older species, a species that's been around much longer than we have, that potentially we have evolved from. Potentially. This gets real interesting because we have to talk about evolution. So did we evolve from rats? Well, we're all mammals, I guess. So. But there are different. We can look at the different primates, and we can see these different structures. We can look at ancient humans who didn't have brains as large as ours. However, there was one ancient human that had a brain larger than ours. Any idea who that might have been? The smartest human that has ever existed is not modern man. No. I'm talking about primates.
Oh.
So we're talking about Homo sapiens, not Homo sapiens. We're talking about a hominid. So it would be, man has evolved from what? But there was a hominid, there was a humanoid structure, an individual that had a bigger brain than modern man. But they all died out. They don't exist anymore. It's Neanderthal man. They had a bigger brain than we do, which irritates a lot of people because they were potentially smarter. But they were here at the same time as Cro-Magnon men. Cro-Magnon men evolved, and they are very close to who we are today, Cro-Magnon man is. And the two of them were trying to live in the same general area, and Neanderthal man disappeared. Maybe they tasted good, I don't know. Maybe they were eaten. But we know all of this stuff because we can look at the evidence, the paleological evidence. We can look at the bones that we find of Neanderthal men, and we can see, well, did somebody gnaw on this guy's bone? Did they make a mark on this bone with their teeth? Or is there a cut mark on the bone where they cut the meat away from the bone? And the answer is there's only a couple cases where they've seen that. So Cro-Magnon man probably didn't eat them, they probably just killed them or something. Or maybe they couldn't survive. Maybe they weren't as resilient as Cro-Magnon man was. Maybe Cro-Magnon man was more adaptive. And Neanderthal man, despite his huge brain, was not able to adapt. They were shorter and squatter. So if you have, we've looked at the DNA. We know what the DNA of Neanderthal man looks like. And there are certain aspects of Neanderthal man that are very specific to him, to that select individual. And people of European ancestry have some Neanderthal DNA. And the only people that don't have Neanderthal DNA, are you ready for this? Are people from Africa. People who live in Africa. Neanderthal man left Africa and went into the Middle East, and they went into Europe. So they were right there. So anybody that evolved, that their ancestry evolved from that group of individuals living in the Middle East or living in Europe. Anybody from that group has Neanderthal DNA. The only people that don't have Neanderthal DNA are people who live in Africa today, the black Africans who live in Africa today, because theoretically their ancestors never left Africa. So they didn't mix with the people up in that area. That includes American Indians. That also includes people from Asia. It also includes the island people, the Micronesians and whatnot. Everybody has Neanderthal DNA except the Africans. Isn't that fascinating or not? Okay. So we can look at all this stuff. I know it's really kind of fascinating. Now we have the ability to look at this. There's a thing called mitochondrial DNA where it follows the mother's bloodline. So it's much easier to follow the mother's bloodline than it is to follow the father's bloodline, because the mitochondrial DNA always follows the mother's bloodline. So we can actually follow the mother's ancestry much easier than we can follow the father's ancestry. All he does, he's just a sperm donor. Okay. But the mitochondrial DNA is actually comes from the mother. As an individual grows, they develop the ability to respond to stimuli. As the organism becomes more and more complex and other variables are introduced, behavior and response will change. This is known as ontogeny, how an individual changes over the lifetime. Ontogeny, how you change. What are your experiences and how have you changed from your youth? What experiences have you had that have changed you? Maybe there was a time in your life where you weren't getting very good food. Or maybe there was a time in your life when you were doing something that you potentially shouldn't have done. Like drank too much alcohol, used too many drugs, or weren't eating nutritious food for one reason or another. That's a possibility. Maybe you decided to try to live on Twinkies for a year. All of this stuff changes because it changes the way your brain develops. I was talking to a student yesterday and we were talking about how people are arrested in an emotional, their brain stops developing as soon as they start using drugs or alcohol. Your brain stops developing. This makes it really, really difficult when we're dealing with somebody who's trying to get off of alcohol. Because you've got a 45-year-old man that comes in, he started drinking when he was 12, guess where his brain is? So we've got to get past that. His brain still thinks he's a stupid, fart-smelling 13-year-old boy. As stupid as kids are when they're 13 years old, they find the dumbest things funny, don't they? And you can watch movies and say, this is a movie for a 13-year-old boy. Nobody else would find this funny. Fart jokes. Or all kinds of interesting things. That is an individual who started using drugs at the age of 13. So who wrote the damn movie? Well, it's probably one of those kids that started drinking at age, or smoking dope at 13. Because marijuana will stop your brain development just like alcohol will. So I know that makes it kind of interesting. So anytime you're dealing with somebody, no matter how old they are, you've got to figure out when they started drinking, because that's where their emotional development has ceased right there. So if you've got a 60-year-old lady who can't stay married to anybody, and she started drinking at age 12, it may be because she started drinking at age 12. As odd as that seems, as strange as that seems, despite the fact that she's lived for, 45 years drinking, 47 years, 48 years drinking. So we have to grow her up. And it's usually an accelerated process because she has all this life experience behind her. So all you have to do is get her to stop drinking alcohol, then her brains will start developing emotionally, and you can actually grow her up relatively quickly. It's accelerated. It's not like it's going to take 48 years before, well, she'll be dead by then anyway.
Does that, I have a question. Does that, depend on the age? Like, what age they are? Like if they're, even if they're maybe 30, their brain can still, when they stop drinking, they can still.
Emotionally, it stopped whenever they started drinking. This is one of the reasons why it's so hard to get a man to connect. If that guy started drinking, and if they drink on a relatively regular basis, their brain hasn't developed emotionally. They're still the 12-year-old mama's boy that they were when they were 12.
So if they were 25, 34, and they stop, their brains start to develop.
Yeah. Oh, very much.
Takes
Yeah, all of a sudden
probably
they'll become
time.
responsible people.
Let's see.
I know. This is a real serious problem with guys. And this is one of the reasons why men are so difficult to deal with sometimes. If they're, and these are hail fellow well met. These are people that everybody likes to be around. Well, sure, they started drinking at 15, so their brain is still stuck at 15. I graduated from college in 1971, so I will go back to my class reunions. We just had a 45th reunion not very long ago, and I'll be talking to these individuals, and if they haven't stopped drinking, because in the fraternities they tend to drink a lot. But some of these guys are exactly the same person they were when they were in college. They still have that mindset. They still want to go out and get drunk as if they're sneaking out on their parents and doing something they're not supposed. Here they are, they're 65, 70 years old. They're successful doctors and lawyers and businessmen. And here they are acting like little kids, acting like teenagers. It's so stupid. It seems stupid to me anyway. Of course, I don't drink, so. I grew up. I grew up during the years that I was actually alive, so I'm no fun at all. And they'll tell you that. I'm no fun at all. I wasn't fun when I was in college, and I'm no fun now. Don't scare me like that. The history of a species helps us, tells us the evolutionary determinants of its behavior. The history of an individual tells us of the developmental determinants. The scientist must regard the organism as a machine made up of billions of neurons, and of course, that's the cognitive way of looking at things. We are a machine, and each neuron is a cog or is a mechanical part, and that's the way cognitive psychology works. Dr. Kine is a cognitive psychologist, and this is the way she sees things, because that's the way she was trained. She's trained to see things as a mechanical structure. They see the brain as a computer, which seems backwards to me. Well, I never really agreed with that mindset, because the brain came first and then the computer. And the computers are becoming more and more complex. But the reality is that a computer can become more complex unless the human brain allows it to. So it's got to mirror the human brain. Right now we're working with artificial intelligence. We're trying to create a machine that can think on its own. Doesn't have to be told, doesn't have to be programmed, can program itself. And we're relatively successful. But the reality is, we've got all of these scientists. Do we really want machines that act like scientists? I mean, some of these guys have Asperger's syndrome. A lot of these guys have Asperger's syndrome. A lot of these guys are obsessive compulsive. Do we really want to create a machine that's obsessive compulsive? Or focuses on one thing and can't get its focus off that one thing? Do we really want that? Yeah, this is really kind of weird. You talk to these individuals, they'll drive you nuts because they won't make eye contact. Ever. Is this really what we're trying to do? We're trying to create people like this? I don't know. Or trying to create machines like this. I know, it's kind of bizarre. A major goal of biological psychology is to use research findings to improve the health and the well-being of humans and other animals. 12. Other animals. Numerous human diseases involve malfunctioning of the brain, and most of these we refer to as mental illnesses. But there are a lot of problems that we have. You catch a cold and you get grouchy. Isn't that the way it works? Is that a mental illness? Is a cold a mental illness? Is a virus a mental illness?
Physiological factor?
I'm sorry?
Could it be like a physiological factor?
It could be.
Okay.
Of course it is. I don't feel good, so I'm going to be mean to everybody I know. I don't feel good. I'm going to make everybody suffer. Men, when they're sick, a lot of times they become big babies. I don't know if you ever noticed that or not.
Yeah.
Okay, just thought. Luckily, I never get sick, so my wife doesn't ever see me as a big baby. There are 3 ways to look at the brain-behavior relations. Somatic intervention, changes in the body, changes the behavior. Somatic, anything that soma means body. So a somatic intervention is a body's intervention with the brain. So any change to the body changes the brain. So I'm sick now, I'm going to change. It's going to change my brain. Somatic intervention would have to do with drugs. Any drugs. That also includes medication that you might potentially be taking. So you may be taking, well, I take blood pressure medicine. They just increased my blood pressure medicine. It's lowered my heart rate. So that should change potentially that could change everything. But the only time I notice it is at night, is at night when I slow down. Right now my blood pressure is probably relatively high. My pulse, I'll tell you what my pulse is, 97. But when I'm sitting down, and it doesn't take very long, when I'm sitting down, my pulse will go down to into the 50s because of this blood pressure medicine. And if I've been sitting there for a while just thinking about them, meditating, it'll go into the 40s. I know, that's pretty good. So, somatic intervention. So medication can do that. One of the things that you have to think about, Stephanie and I were talking about this, yesterday? Yes, yesterday. We were talking about this yesterday. Sometimes doctors will give you medication and it will kill you. That medication will kill you. And of course, they're very myopic. They're only thinking of curing this problem. But by giving you that medication, it creates another problem. Well, they don't care about that other problem because all they want to do is fix the first problem. And so sometimes it's like a pyramid. It's like an avalanche. It just builds and builds and builds and builds. So they're going to cure your diabetes, and by doing that, they give you a medication that lowers your circulation, and all of a sudden you've got circulation problems. How are we going to fix that? Well, we can't give you a medication that increases your circulation because that will accelerate your diabetes. Wait a minute. They've created the problem. They've created a new problem. Now you have to solve that problem. As horrible as that may seem. Okay. Behavioral interventions, psychological changes occur, and this changes body structure or function. I'm trying to think of an example. Psychological, changing your body. Something psychological. You get depressed. So how do you fix your depression? How do you fix your depression? Well, if you're a female, potentially one of the ways to make you feel better is to eat fatty foods, sure. Chocolate, ice cream. All this stuff works. It's got tryptophan in it. Tryptophan is a precursor for serotonin. You eat ice cream, it potentially raises your serotonin level. Now you feel better. Okay, so every time you get depressed, guess what happens next? You eat ice cream, of course, to fix yourself. And now your body has changed. All of a sudden you're sedentary and you've got cankles. You're fat as a toad.
More depression. Gonna eat more ice cream.
And now I'm depressed because I'm so fat, so I have to have ice cream. And that has changed your body function. That's changed your and now you got diabetes, damn it, because you eat all that ice cream. I was behind a lady in the line. She had all this diet pop. She had a whole cart full of stuff, and she had like 4 cases or 4 12-packs of diet pop. And on top of all that diet pop, she had Little Debbie's, she had cupcakes, she had, I don't know, Little Debbie's. I mean, it was all this junk. So here she was going to control her soda, her pop consumption by drinking diet pop, but she had all the sugar on top of it. And she was as fat as a toad. Oh, she had no muscle mass whatsoever. It was just fat. And she had globs of fat around her wrists. She had fat ankles. Her face was fat, and she was pasty. She was pasty. I know I'm making her sound quite attractive. And she hadn't washed her hair in like. It was stringy and smelly, and it was nasty. Anyway, so sometimes your behavior can change. Your psychological changes can affect your body structure. So how do guys, or if a guy's depressed, what does he do? A lady's depressed, the best way to solve that depression is by eating fatty foods. That would work. Raises your tryptophan level, but it doesn't work for guys. For females, you can eat chocolate and it makes you feel good, but it doesn't work for guys. Chocolate doesn't work for us. There's something wrong with our hormones. What would a guy do if he got depressed? Works every time. We get pissed off, we get angry. So either we punch something, hopefully not someone, but we'll punch something, or we'll go to the gym and we'll work out. So males and females are like almost opposites. She eats, he goes out and works out. And hopefully he doesn't get into a fight. Okay. Correlation, how do changes in somatic variables affect behavioral variables? And we're going to answer that question. We're going to be answering it over the semester. If we increase testosterone in a male, will it increase his sexual response? If I give a male a shot at testosterone, will it increase his sexual response? Can we cause the same effect by electrically stimulating his brain? And the answer is yes, of course. We can, if we increase your testosterone and make him want to have sex. That's the way it works. That's why he has testicles, and they put out all this testosterone. We need to reproduce. We need to reproduce our species. So yes, testosterone. The higher the testosterone level, the greater the sexual response. Can we stimulate the brain and get the same response? The answer is yes. I know, it's kind of strange. If we cut his vagus nerve, will he lack sexual response? If we cut his vagus nerve, it will potentially kill him, but it's the vagus nerve that allows somebody who is a quadriplegic to have a sexual response, as confusing as that is. Okay, so we need to stop right here. We'll pick this up next time. Turn off the video. Okay.